Hello, friends. It's Michael Parker, back to you after a while producing other shows. Today, I am with Dr. Karladine Graves. She is a medical doctor, I believe a general practitioner, and she is the head of the Personal Healthcare Network, which is a coalition of, I believe, 35,000 doctors. Is that correct?
Well, it has a bandwidth of that. What we do is we meet every other Monday as leaders of those groups. And then those leaders go back to their organizations and they disperse the information that we have discussed as a group. And it has previously been a wide variety of subjects, all the way from legislation to also drug pricing and why the middlemen and the group purchasing organizations are actually robbing the American people and what we can do about it. And also, we have been fighting against of course, Obamacare now for a long time. And part of the group from Texas who filed a lawsuit with the Supreme Court in regard to Obamacare actually being unconstitutional. They are part of our group also. But you have to remember that those leaders go back to their organizations and then disperse the information we have discussed. And with COVID, oh my, that's taken over most of our discussions as of recent.
In December, I started following the COVID story because I delve in these waters and these types of issues interest me. And I started reading, and I believe you probably became aware of it at the same time, if not earlier, that this thing was happening. And the things that I was reading made me very concerned. And of course, it more came to the fore here in the US in January and February, and then the lockdowns happened in March. And your group presented a letter to President Trump, is that correct, regarding HCQ, hydroxychloroquine?
Yes, that is correct. Back in late December, part of our group noted the warning that the ophthalmologist in China was giving to the world, actually. And then, as we all know, he was shut down by the Chinese government. We also know that when he became sick himself, he had between 7 and 8 negative tests for COVID. And then when he finally turned positive in the very late part of January, it was within a week he actually died and was unable to actually beat it. And he actually died from the very thing that he was warning the world about. But we could see this and we could see it coming. So we began to do research. And as we began to research, we found out that this obviously was a virus. And so we began to research multiple antiviral medications. And so we discovered that Dr. Fauci had used hydroxychloroquine in the very early years of HIV because there were no real antivirals per se. And so he began to look at that as a possibility for HIV. And then we also saw that where he had used the hydroxychloroquine or HCQ in the SARS-1 as well as in the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, as it has an acronym for. And so he touted at that time that the hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ, was very effective as an antiviral. And so we began to study, the chemistry of it. We began to study the mechanism as to how it actually worked. Did it kill the virus, or did it do something else different? And we discovered that it does not kill the virus. What HCQ does, it provides a coating around the cell so that the virus cannot get in the cell. And those of us who've had even a little bit of biology or just knowledge of science, we know that a virus must have a living cell in order to live. and it's parasitical. And I have used the analogy that I think that viruses must be bureaucrats because they have to live off of something else. And so anyway, if they don't get into the cell, they can't survive, and so they die out. But if you have a very high load of the virus, then there may be some of those viruses that even get in despite the HCQ. And so what HCQ does, though, it opens a door for zinc.
Yes.
Zinc in nature is very difficult to get intracellular doses that are high enough to actually be of benefit. People don't know that. But the HCQ opens up a door, letting that zinc in. And what does the zinc do? Well, the zinc actually fools the virus and says, hey, let me help you replicate with your RNA. And instead, it misfires the RNA and the virus dies out. That's why it is so vital that individuals know that they must have the hydroxychloroquine with the zinc. And if I may just quickly say that a lot of the studies that we now have had retracted and been found to be erroneous information, such as that of
The Lancet,
JAMA,
or the new
Lancet, the New England Journal, we can just name them. But nevertheless, many of them did not use zinc. They did not use it. And they used it maybe later in the illness, and they used doses that we would normally never use in patients, such as the Brazilian study. What they did to those patients was inhumane.
They gave them exorbitantly high amounts or too little?
Yes, they gave them high amounts that we would never, 1,600 milligrams a day, that is ridiculous. What we're giving now as treatment is that for 5 days, 200 milligrams,
Yep.
2 times a day for 5 days. Okay, a rheumatoid arthritic patient or a lupus patient takes 200 milligrams normally 2 times a day the rest of their life. We're asking for 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
And when Dr. Fauci, I actually heard an interview with him that said, a correspondent asked him, so why not hydroxychloroquine? And Dr. Fauci answered, because it would be such much higher doses we would need to use in COVID than we would in lupus or rheumatoid. That is an untruth. I mean, just flat out. Why? Because each hydroxychloroquine tablet that you take has a 22.4 day half-life.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we've had within our group a statistician who actually did figure that the hydroxychloroquine accumulates in the body and continues to work, even though you might not be taking it orally. And so that's why we are able to treat with such a low dose for a short period of time.
Okay, so that begs the question. In 2005, when Dr. Fauci said that hydroxychloroquine was a viable treatment for other forms of coronaviruses, what was the amount that he was administering or advising people to use at that point?
You know, Mike, you have asked me a question that I have not the answer to, and I apologize.
That's all right. I would bet it's the amount that he's saying is too much now. I'm just going to guess.
Well, I don't know, but you have given me something that I need to look up and see if that data is available. But
The reason I say that, I don't mean to cut you off, is that he and Redfield of the CDC have gone back and forth on so many things they said that it wouldn't surprise me that this is yet another thing in which they just act like they didn't say something prior. So that's speculation and part of perhaps my own cynicism, but it wouldn't surprise me. But I want to get to something. Basically, you have demonstrated, for those who don't know, that HCQ can be used safely. And one of the arguments was that it can't be used safely. Well, of course it can be used safely. It's an old drug. It's been around since the 30s. If I'm going to a foreign country, I have a great Pyrenees. Doctor, you were demonstrating that HCQ as an old drug is widely prescribed for a variety of uses. And most notably, it started out as an anti-malarial drug. And if I'm going overseas to a subtropic kind of place where they might have malaria, I would get that. And it probably wouldn't be very difficult to get. Is that correct? I mean, I go to my doctor, I say I'm going to Africa, the Philippines, or someplace, and they give it to me. So that's out the window. That's not exactly true. But one of the things that also bothers me is that in April, all of these studies started emerging that in certain states here in the US, that the correctional departments and the prisons within the states were beginning to stockpile HCQ. And for example, Governor Sisolak in Nevada, who is a Democrat, basically forbade the use of HCQ for the treatment of COVID. But I've got the articles here. They came out in the Las Vegas Review, I think was the paper. It was widespread that Nevada, Oregon, there were several states that were stockpiling up on this, and they were using it on their prison community. Now, the caveat to that is they're saying, well, we're not exactly using it just on on people who are being treated for COVID. This is also for the other uses, rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera. In the case of Oregon, a month later, they retracted that and they said, hey, even though one of their top doctors in Oregon said that we should use this, a month later, when I guess the FDA said, no, we're not going to allow this for use of treating COVID anymore, the Oregon Department of Correction said, okay, we're not going to use it anymore. So my question would be, well, that gave them plenty of time to buy a bunch, right? And the other thing is people say that, we don't want to run short of it. Well, I would say within the US, unless all of our drugs are made in China, why could private enterprise not be challenged to say, you know what, there's a market here. We need HCQ. Let's ramp up our manufacturing of that. So this idea that you can't use it, but we could use it, and this idea that there's not enough all seems faulty and completely disingenuous to me. Am I wrong?
You are not wrong. And if we really look into the stockpile, we have about 60 million doses of hydroxychloroquine that has been stockpiled by the government. And there is one man and one man only that can unlock those stockpiles. And that is Dr. Robert Kadlec. And he is the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response. And he has a long history of, and many of your listeners are going to go, this woman is a conspiracy theorist. No, I'm not. I'm a factual individual.
You're a medical doctor.
I've had to be factual in order to be effective. Because if you're not factual, you'll eventually be found out. And you cannot be effective. And so we know that Dr. Kadlec actually is head of the Strategic National Stockpile. And he has a long history in bioterrorism. And he has aligned himself with intelligence, with people at the Pentagon. In fact, he was actually working at Fort Detrick with...
Oh boy. I'm listening.
Well, I didn't know if you wanted to stop. He has actually been working, or he worked with Fort Detrick with the anthrax vaccine. It was in quotations that he personally injected 800 of our service, armed service individuals with the anthrax vaccine. And we know now that that is directly associated with the Gulf War syndrome. And so my question is this: we're rushing to a vaccine. How do we know that there may not be repercussions years later, as there has been with the anthrax vaccine? And so we must be careful what we ask for, because we might get it.
Well, I think that's a plausible and reasonable expectation. And this COVID virus has shown up so quickly that it begs the question, is that a reasonable amount of time to actually create a virus? And I'm not a virologist, so every year they change the flu shot. I'm going to admit right here, I never get the flu shot. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I choose what I put in my body carefully. That said, I like to drink beer, but and watch football.
Only with barbecue. There
you go. So I do all of that. But my question is, is it reasonable to expect that all of these people, these various companies, Moderna, AstraZeneca, you and I were discussing this beforehand, could come up with a vaccine in this short a period of time when you would think this would take years to prepare? And my next question would be is, how many viral vaccines exist that are functional, that work?
Very few.
That's what I thought.
Now, there's a good reason why, and it goes back to stability. You have a fairly stable virus in measles. That's a good example because that's a vaccine that we've had for years, and it seems it works well because that particular virus is stable. However, we are dealing now with an unstable virus, just as flu is an unstable virus.
When you say unstable, you mean a mutating virus. Is that correct, or something else?
That is correct.
Okay.
It mutates very easily. Now, that brings us up to a whole new set of issues. We know that the coronavirus is a virus that is highly contagious. The common cold is highly contagious. We all know that. We've known it for years. Coronaviruses, there are many different types of coronaviruses.
Right.
And viruses are very particular. They do not, in nature, go outside of their species. It's like, I have used the example of a cow mutating with a pig. That doesn't happen in nature normally. And so what we have discovered by several now, and first discovered and sequenced in India by scientists there, that the virus that we are dealing with, the COVID-19, is actually a mutated virus with HIV-1. And the particular portion of that virus is glycoprotein 120. And there are 4 separate inserts within the coronavirus that appear to have been placed there in an unnatural setting.
The paper that I think you're talking about, that was released January 30th, and then they received a lot of heat about it. I tried to read it last night. Not being a scientist, I didn't fully understand it. I tried to also read some people refuting that. But tell us what happened with that paper and what's happening with it now.
Well, it got scrubbed, basically, from the view of most individuals very quickly. And we have others who have also sequenced. And I think that we have certainly the woman, the Chinese scientist who recently came out and
Yes.
said she also knew that this was a engineered type of a virus. We also know that as far as the bat coronavirus, we know as fact. Now, people can say, there she goes again, off on a conspiracy theory. No, it's fact. They can look it up themselves. They're capable. They can look up and see that bat coronavirus was being studied at
Yes.
Fort Detrick in 2015. And they wrote a paper on it in 2017. We also know that there are certain laboratories that are only approved for a 3 and 4 level of viral studies that would certainly be that of a bioterrorist weapon should we be making one. And that is Chapel Hill, that is Vanderbilt, and that is Boston. We also know that in Boston, the chemist at Harvard that was actually arrested, Dr. Lieber. And so he was arrested for actually working with the Chinese. However, also one of those individuals that was working in his laboratory, which is a Chinese nationalist,
that's right,
if we remember, was stopped at Logan Airport. Why were they stopped? Because it wasn't the first time that this has probably happened, and they had cameras in the lab showing that he was picking up the vials. Now, he put those vials in his socks, if you remember correctly.
I didn't remember that part, but
he was stopped at the Logan Airport with these vials in his socks. I have not yet, and I continue to ask, what virus was in those vials he was taking back to China? Why isn't anyone asking that question and getting the answer? Why aren't our people in Congress, our Senate, why is our government, why is the FDA, the CDC, what's the secret here that he was carrying in his socks? I want to know. And I think the American people need to know.
I agree. And all of the things that you've just mentioned, people can raise their eyebrows out, but I remember reading all of these stories as they happened. And I believe last July, not this July, but the previous, there was also more Chinese nationalists in a P4 lab in Canada. I believe it was, is it Manitoba? I can't remember the name of the particular town that the lab was in, but she and her husband were deported along with their students under very mysterious circumstances, and it seemed like they were potentially stealing intellectual property. And in all of these cases, the intellectual property would be biological. It's not O's and ones. It's not data. It is an actual biological process. But I don't want to get off on that too much. Hopefully you and I can do a series on this because there's so many things. So let's just say, you're right. Earlier this week, this woman who's, I don't have her name in front of me, I apologize, appeared on Tucker Carlson, and she's appeared in other news reports saying that she has the proof that this was created in a lab in Wuhan. You and I think potentially it also had some help in Fort Detrick and maybe other places, that it is a man-made chimera type virus. I did some looking around last night. There's probably 10 or 12 other scientists that have said similar things. So this isn't just one woman stating this. This is out there. All of these people have been vilified for what they've said, just as HCQ has been vilified, which is our segue. So let's go back to that. Tell us what it is that you're trying to do with your petition, which I did sign yesterday, by the way. Explain to people what that is, and we're going to provide a link for that and why this is important that they sign it.
Well, we all know that President Trump had the opportunity to meet with his personal physician. And to me, the sacred relationship, and it is a sacred relationship in being a physician, with the patient, not with bureaucrats, not with government officials, not with governors, not with your physician. You should have a relationship and have the right that President Trump had, which was meeting with his personal physician. They discussed it together and decided that they would move forward with taking the hydroxychloroquine and the zinc. And I think that it is a disservice to the American people that they would not have the same right, and that the physician would not have the same right to use the hydroxychloroquine without repercussion, because we don't want them. There has been repercussions all over this nation for physicians who have actually ordered the hydroxychloroquine. And I will include myself in that, because I had a patient that I was treating for COVID with the hydroxychloroquine, and her husband, her ex-husband, I should say, is an oncologist, and he reported me to my Board of Healing Arts saying that I was using a medication that was not FDA approved for COVID, that it could be dangerous and it could have killed his ex-wife. Now, I don't know when he became so concerned about his ex-wife's health, but he certainly was concerned that I used HCQ. And so that, of course, has to be investigated by the Missouri Board of Healing Arts. And to my knowledge, they are still investigating and have been since June of this year. But that has not stopped me from actually reaching out and helping individuals who have no place else to turn. And thus far, those that I have treated, I have had no one that has been hospitalized for further disease of the COVID. Now, I had two. One was an elderly gentleman who became scared during the night because he couldn't breathe and went to the hospital. And he discovered very quickly they were not going to give him hydroxychloroquine. So his wife and I, she was my undercover delivery, and she took and she snuck it into the hospital when he was in ICU and gave it to him there. And he got better and he was discharged. I have another one that went into the hospital because he became very scared and anxious, and soon found that they weren't going to treat him in the hospital certainly any better than what he was actually getting at home. In fact, he called me yesterday and apologized and saying, "I'm sorry, I became so anxious and frightened that I went to the hospital." But others, I've had no one go on the ventilator. I've had no one yet who has succumbed. They thus far are doing very well, and I've had no side effect. In fact, I want to quickly mention this, that I was able to talk directly with the cardiologist who is the world-known QT interval expert around the world. I talked with this individual personally. We cannot name the name, nor can we name the institution, because they would be fired. I asked them personally if they would have any objections to using hydroxychloroquine or HCQ with azithromycin. And the reply back was absolutely, I would have no difficulty with prescribing it nor using it if need be. And then the individual said, Well, what I do worry about is how the media has made this so difficult, as well as the lawyers who are just looking for an excuse to make someone an example. And so this is what we've been dealing with. And it is a shame because it has cost the American people thousands of lives that needlessly probably have died, as well as it's caused fear, suffering, not counting our economy.
Dr. Graves, imagine, and I know that you have, but I just have to spell this out to the listeners. Think about this. I know much of what you're saying just because I choose to get my news in various places. And HCQ, you presented this letter to President Trump. The next day, he claims it's a possibility it could be a game changer. So the obvious thing happened. Immediately, the media jumped all over it. And, whatever he wants is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And I and others have said he should have used reverse psychology and say, this is the worst thing he could possibly do. And guess what? A lot of people would be better. And that seems like an oversimplification, but I think that's exactly what would have happened. So if HCQ works as a prophylaxis, if people could have gone on it, this cheap drug, I don't know exactly how cheap it is, but it's a drug that people have been able to get easily for decades, not expensive to manufacture, has a pretty good safety record. If people could have gone on this as a prophylaxis, maybe we didn't need to shut things down. What if there had been a national mandate in which we could have all agreed that this was a drug that people could use with very few side effects? Every time a drug commercial comes on my television, 30 to 45 seconds of the ad are the various side effects. So don't tell me that we do not take drugs that have a lot of side effects. So imagine if we had been able to take this drug early on, perhaps we wouldn't have had to shut down all these businesses, schools, places of worship, and think about all the people that wouldn't have died alone in hospitals where their families were not able to visit them. Think of all the deaths of despair from people who lost their businesses or their life savings. Maybe they sunk into despair through alcohol, drugs, or committed suicide. All of these things might not have happened in an alternate universe in which HCQ could have been used. Now, that brings me to my next question that I've been thinking about, and you'll help me understand this. HCQ as a prophylaxis is best administered in the first days. Well, I could be taking it as a prophylaxis from the get-go, but let's just say I wasn't, and I just discovered that I have COVID, or I suspect that I do. Now, knock on wood, I have not had this, so I haven't gone to a doctor about it. But let's say that by the time I go to the doctor, now it's been a week or two, I'm feeling pretty bad. And if the doctor can even see me knowing that I have COVID, is the HCQ was it still going to work at that point?
We have discovered that actually hydroxychloroquine is best to be used within the first 5 days. Now, I use the example of Tamiflu. Tamiflu, where many people are actually accustomed to and know what Tamiflu is. It's an antiviral for the flu. And so when you have the flu, if you go to the doctor, one of the first questions you will note that they will ask is, when did your symptoms first start? That's not just to be, it's not rhetorical. It is, what that means is they want to know if they can catch the virus within a window of opportunity to actually decrease the viral load and actually help the individual. And so the very same thing is true of the COVID. My goodness, the longer you leave something there, the more it's going to grow and multiply. I mean, whether it be cancer, whether it be your blood sugar and you don't take care of it, it doesn't matter. My goodness, where's common sense here? And so you want to treat it earlier than later. However, there are some studies that show that in using the zinc, using the low dose hydroxychloroquine, using the azithromycin or doxycycline, that there have been recoveries of individuals. You have a less percentage of recovery, but nevertheless, you still, I wouldn't hesitate. I've treated patients now across this nation who maybe have had it for 8 to 9 days. And yes, it has benefited them. Now, well, let me backtrack just a little bit. It has taken longer for them to recover. And in some cases, it's taken a bit of a higher dose, like Dr. George Fareed there in California is using. Dr. Fareed is using actually 600 milligrams for the first 5 days. And he is using 50 milligrams of zinc 3 times a day. He's had no repercussions of that, of side effects, and he's had very good success with it. And I have noticed, though, that in many cases, those individuals who have had it for 8 to 10 days, and they're not getting better and they're getting worse, I've had to extend the length of time I have treated them. But nevertheless, we've still been successful.
This has been my understanding of it. I just wanted to hear it from you. And I told my family, my immediate family and my extended family, if I or you or any of us get COVID, demand, if you can, HCQ. There is zero question in my mind personally that everything should be on the, if this is the pandemic of the epic scale that it is being described, that everything should be on the table. And that sacred connection between doctor and patient should be honored. And if my doctor and I agree this is a way that I can be treated, then I don't see why the government should be interfering in that. And I would even make this analogy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure I'm going to upset some people with what I'm about to say, but not a doctor, not a lawyer, but just a guy thinking out loud. Roe versus Wade provided a fundamental right to choose for a woman to determine her reproductive health and a medical procedure performed upon her body by a doctor. Doesn't something like that in some way convey another precedent that if I have the right to choose that, I also have the right to choose to take a therapeutic drug? Is this a stretch, or is this a logical?
I don't think that's a stretch. I don't think that's a stretch at all. I think that I call it the right to choose. That's exactly what I've called it. And I think that the right of choice should be given to the American people. Now, also, those abortions that you were talking about, the doctor does not suffer from a repercussion. Why should they have a repercussion in giving a life-saving, a potential life-saving medication? Please, where are Americans' common sense?
Right.
I really am, I'm frightened because there seems to be so little of it and lack of it. Or is this nefariously being deceptive? What's the background of this? Are we willing to kill for profit as a society in America? We must ask ourselves that. Are we willing to let those suffer who may not had to suffer or even to die? Is it humane that we had COVID positive patients put in nursing homes?
Right. Every time I hear somebody say of my friends, "Oh, we should follow New York's lead," I'm like, "Are you high?" They put people, COVID positive people, in nursing homes. You know who's nursing homes? Old people. And they're there because they are elderly and they probably have underlying conditions. I mean, I'm sorry, that makes me so mad to hear about this, They did the same thing, I believe, in Washington. They were going to do it in California. I mean, it just blows my mind. And then I believe in Chicago, we had the guy that was, the young man that was COVID positive that was beating elderly patients. I mean, the whole thing is just infuriating. It makes no sense. It would almost make a cynical person think that they were intentionally trying to infect people to get the rates of deaths up.
Well, they are paid, the nursing homes are paid $15,000 by Social Security for those COVID patients that are being brought in.
And the hospitals get 39 grand for a COVID.
35 to 39 per patient. And of course, the hospital association wants everything driven into the hospitals. Yet, it kind of backfired on them, because a lot of hospitals now, and unfortunately, a lot of rural hospitals have gone broke and are shutting their doors, which is a disservice to those who are in outskirt areas that don't have the medical care that certainly is provided in larger centers.
Can you imagine that the byproduct of a health scare would be that medical institutions started closing because they didn't have enough business? I mean, it's it's remarkable. And I've heard the back and forths of people, in March and April and May, people were putting up videos where they're saying they were going to particular hospitals and it didn't seem to be anybody there. And then other people were like saying, how could you dare do that? This hospital, there's plenty of people here and we're waiting for the onslaught of COVID victims. And so, not working in the medical community, I can't speak to whether that was true or not. But what I do know is that those giant boats that we docked in New York and in Los Angeles, the Mercy and the Hope, I believe, or whatever it was, those were criminally underused, in my opinion, and eventually sent on their way. And there were so many things that have happened in this pandemic that don't make sense to me, that I don't think it's all by accident. I think that's intellectually dishonest to take all of these things and go, well, we were just, we were doing it on the fly, and it's an emergency, and it makes people wonder, what was the purpose of this? What is the end point of this? And now we get to the schools. I have a daughter who is in high school. I have another daughter who is beginning her freshman year of college. My daughter who's beginning her freshman year of college is going to get to go to college, but all of her classes will be virtual. She's going to do them in her dorm room. My daughter who's in high school is in her bedroom right now doing her classes. And I have heard from a few different people, including Barbara Ferrar, who is the unelected health official here in Los Angeles, that kids will be allowed to go back to school when? After the election. I mean, it seems incredibly transparent. A friend of mine posted on social media the other day, and I believe he's in Northern California or in Oregon, that he received an email from his daughter's school that we're looking at starting school on November the 4th.
Oh, my.
I mean, now, people say, Parker, this is anecdotal. Well, okay, it is anecdotal. I'll tell you something else that's anecdotal. In my social circle, and I don't know how many COVID patients you've treated, but in my social circle, I think I know of 4 or 5, actually 6 people that supposedly have tested positive for COVID. Of those 6, all of them have stayed home. They're not being treated with drugs that I know of. They didn't go into hospital, and they just wrote it out. So not preventing people from going to hospitals is one way of keeping them from dying, it seems. They don't get put on a ventilator or some other excessive therapy. But all of these people, and I didn't want to pry too much, in all of these cases, these are friends of my daughters, families. And I don't want to say, hey, can you ask them if they took HCQ? But I believe in one family's case in particular, they're kind of health nuts. They just took Tylenol. They stayed at home, wrote it out for 2 or 3 weeks. And then she knows 2 other young people who have it. The same thing. They've just written it out at home. I am not giving medical advice. You're a doctor, but it seems to me like, and I know this affects a lot of people differently. We have one kid come over here who tested positive, but was asymptomatic. I was really irked at him because I found out this after the fact, and we all got tested shortly after. But in my personal sphere, the only people that I know that have had it were either asymptomatic or stayed at home and just wrote it out.
I think that that's good because they built up their own immunity. And I think there are some who can't do that.
Right.
And so for those who cannot or do not wish to, there again, I'm back to the same thing. I think that they should be given that right, and the doctor should not be held accountable for just doing what they felt was clinically prudent. Therefore, I think that there are a lot of people that can actually build up their own immunity. And I think that you know how I feel about actually preparing the body, especially as we go into winter. Now, there in California, it's not near as much the caution that we have in certainly different climate areas. But I do think that we need to pay particular attention. We need to be taking vitamin D. Vitamin D is a great immune builder. And we need to be taking 5,000 milligrams. Sure, you live in sunny California. How much time do you actually spend out there? You're not going to really get that much. I mean,
Doctor, you said 5,000 milligrams?
5,000 international units. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
If I said milligrams. 5,000 international units. And it's vitamin D3. That's what's absorbed.
Okay. The reason I ask is when all this started happening, I immediately went to GNC. I bought D, I bought zinc. I think we bought magnesium, vitamin C. I mean, everything, the stuff that I had read, plus what the woman at the counter was telling me, we bought all of that. So we've been taking that from the get-go. But you mentioned the other day copper as well, which I haven't taken.
Yes.
How does copper work in this?
Well, copper helps your zinc actually to not only perform better, but it also allows the zinc to stay around longer and be utilized at a more efficient level. We have discovered this over time. There are also some physicians who have been saying 2% Lugol solution. Now, what in the world is a Lugol solution? It's iodine. And they start out by taking 1 drop in 3 ounces of water. Mm-hmm. And then maybe 2 or 3 days later, they may take 2 drops, and they get it up to 6 drops a day. And they do this very steadily, but in increments. And there are some physicians that are advocating that because they say that it actually helps boost the immune system. And I think that anything that we can do to on our own, we should certainly take advantage of it.
I agree.
But I think that we also need to work together synergistically with the allopathic as well as the interventionist, because I think that we have a place together, especially in this circumstance, because if COVID truly is, and it appears that it is, an engineered virus, then our bodies may not be able to naturally combat this on their own, on our bodies, because if it's something that's engineered, our bodies are completely baffled by this virus. Like, what is this? It's a crossover of an HIV and a coronavirus. And so there are individuals who are going to need that extra help. And
Doctor, I agree with you, and I'm not trying to imply that people shouldn't follow the advice of their doctors. And we're just having this discussion, but you're exactly right, which takes us back to the HCQ, which I just don't understand. I don't understand why we can't have it. And then there's the story of some pharmacies, a doctor who does finally prescribe it to you for COVID, then being shot down because the pharmacy won't give it to the patient.
We have that very commonly. In fact, yesterday, I just ran into that with a pharmacist. I have a patient that has been running 102 fever, very sick, has a cough, shortness of breath, definite signs of COVID, and tested positive. Therefore, I was asked to please order the medication. They wanted to take it, so I did. I got a call from the pharmacist and said, we will fill the azithromycin and the zinc, but we will not do the hydroxychloroquine because we do not do our distributing of medications on feelings and theories. And I said, well, that's good. I'm glad that you are a pharmacist that does this on science. And so I began to list the scientific papers that are out there, and I asked if they had briefed themselves on it because they were still going on the erroneous studies that came out of Lancet that had to be retracted, New England Journal, and so on. And so that pharmacist was astounded at the information that I was giving them. And before the conversation was over, the pharmacist said, I am going to fill this prescription for this patient. And they want more information, and I am giving them more information. And I want us to have that information. I want pharmacists to have this information because the pharmacy boards have gotten together with the governors.
Yeah. And
they have prohibited pharmacists from actually using it. In fact, for the first time in my over 40 years of practicing medicine, I had one pharmacist that said, I don't like your protocol. I will give the patient the protocol I feel comfortable with. I was shocked.
That's not their job.
That is not their job. But nevertheless, that's what they did. And so I kindly thank them for at least giving any of the hydroxychloroquine to the patient. And I was able to get further hydroxychloroquine from someplace else for that particular patient.
This petition that is on your website that I signed yesterday, when do you anticipate reaching the number that you want to reach? And then when you do, are you presenting that to President Trump, or who are you presenting that to?
That will go to the hand of President Trump, just as did the letter that a few of us got together and put together back in March. We put the letter together for President Trump, letting him know about hydroxychloroquine, letting him know the previous studies that Dr. Fauci had done, the findings, and other scientists, and that it was an antiviral that could be a game changer for the American people, that we wouldn't have to shut down, that we could go on about our lives. Never in my wildest dream, nor anyone else that wrote the letter to the president with all of us together, we never dreamt that the media would do what it did and immediately turn against a drug that cost 0.05 cents to make a tablet, and that we could widely distribute through our society, as has China, as has Russia, in giving their citizens hydroxychloroquine and zinc. We never dreamt that this would happen. And I still, in my heart of hearts, can I prove it? No, I can't prove it. But I can say this, that I think that this has been driven by greed. And that this remdesivir that they keep talking about,
yes,
it is indespicable to me that Dr. Fauci would say that this was going to, his study was going to be absolutely something that should be followed. What Dr. Fauci studied was remdesivir for 5 days as opposed to 10 days. You don't do a drug study like that. You do a drug study up against a placebo or another drug. Why didn't he compare it to hydroxychloroquine and zinc and azithromycin rather than just 5 days of remdesivir compared to 10 days of remdesivir? That's not a scientific study. He knows better than that. Or if he doesn't, then I'm sorry, I'm going to question some other issues that he certainly has touted.
Of course he knows. Hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, is it, I'm trying to remember the term. Is it out of copyright? What's the word I'm looking for? That it's in the public domain or something, whereas remdesivir, someone owns that drug. And I read something the other day, which I just find astounding, and correct me if I'm wrong, $1,000 a tablet or something?
No, it's $3,000 to $4,000 a vial.
A vial. So it's a liquid or a...
It has, the patient has, there again, listeners, please listen. Where is our common sense? When in American history, if you had, Mike, if you had cancer, and I said, Mike, we can get this cancer out of your thyroid right now, and you can go on about your business. But instead, I say, Mike, we're going to wait until that cancer spreads through your whole thyroid. And then we're going to have you have this major operation. You'll have a neck dissection. What
I would want my family to sue you. I would die. Right?
Yes. Please tell your lawyer, sue this woman. Yes. And where in American history have we tried to wait until someone is so sick that we have to put them with high volumes of oxygen? And we also found out all those ventilators. I am so angry because I know of two brothers, 16 and 14 years old, who were put on ventilators. And the 16-year-old has asthma. And he more than likely will have scarring from that ventilator the rest of his life and have to deal with this. And both of those brothers had to have tracheotomies. And it was totally and most likely unnecessary. Why? What is the reason? And if hydroxychloroquine can be given to rheumatoid arthritic patients, as the Lupus Foundation has said, without an electrocardiogram or without a cardiac workup, no questions asked, they just give it to their lupus patients, 200 milligrams 2 times a day for the rest of their life. How does that tablet change from its safety to a non-safe when we just give it for COVID? Where is the logic in this? It is frightening to me. And if people can't see that, I'm sorry, they are willfully blinded.
You had mentioned to me, we've been texting back and forth. You mentioned that you came across a study that said 2 billion people on the globe are using HCQ. Am I understanding that correct? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
2 billion people out of 7 billion plus. That's a large number. And yet we're having this discussion about being able to use it in the US.
Well, we have a study that shows it's a worldwide study of over 2 billion people that took hydroxychloroquine. That doesn't mean that only 2 billion people have taken it. It just means that that's what the study encompassed.
And they took it for COVID, or they took it for all of these various illnesses combined?
They took it for COVID.
Wow.
Only for COVID. And our graph that I believe I sent you shows that the countries that have used the hydroxychloroquine early, which, by the way, does show communist countries certainly have, and it shows the decrease in the spread of COVID and the recovery of those individuals. Whereas there are 3 countries particularly that we should pay attention to that are lagging behind in the death rates and the morbidity.
And they are?
And they are the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States.
You mentioned that some of these communist countries are using it with success, and I would posit that these countries have already strained health industries. So they made the choice that, look, you know what? We probably don't have the infrastructure to handle all of these people getting sick. So let's roll the bones and give them COVID so we don't overwhelm our health system. And in turn, that seems to have been the right decision. Yet we, with the foremost 21st century medical infrastructure, we were going to slow the curve, or, you know, these various things, and we weren't going to overwhelm our healthcare system, but we essentially outlawed HCQ, which, if we had allowed people to take that, if I could have, okay, you don't want to make it over the counter, I get it. But what if I could go into my doctor and just say, doctor, I work, I've got a family, I'm a busy man, we're worried, my kids need to go to school. Can you please put me on this little treatment of HCQ so we don't get it until this thing goes over? As the same thing, if I said I was going to Africa or wherever, I'm going over there on business, I don't want to get sick, why couldn't we do that?
Well,
right?
I think that's a question for the FDA.
Yes.
I think that's a question for Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, who heads the NIH. I think that's a question for Dr. Robert Cadlick, who is...
This is the one character in this story that I'm not familiar with. So this sounds insidious when you mention the anthrax stuff. And I remember the Gulf War syndrome. I thought it was related to Agent Orange or something they were spraying at the time. I don't remember the name of it, but this doesn't sound good. And this man that you're talking about, I'm not familiar with him.
Previous flight surgeon, had a military career, obviously a physician. He is under the jurisdiction of the HHS, and he has been around for a long time. He's been around probably since 2006, and he has positioned himself to be one of Big Pharma's heroes, because he actually controls the material that goes into our pharmaceutical manufacturing. And he has made himself basically, I think, a kingpin in all of this. But yet he has stayed in the background, and he is not as well known, and put Dr. Fauci out there in front, Dr. Collins, Dr. Redfield, even Dr. Bright, Dr. Brooks. They're the ones that we see the faces to. Mm-hmm. But we don't see the face of Dr. Robert Cadlick, who actually is the sole proprietor over the control of most of our, well, in fact, all of our stockpiles, and he was actually part of Emergent Biosolutions. And he gave $2 billion to his old company for smallpox vaccinations. Now, why?
He gave them $2 billion for smallpox, but we already had a smallpox vaccination, correct? I mean, I'm not following. exactly.
Well,
He was in a position to give them money, and it's a
he was in a
company.
position to give them money, and he gave them $2 billion for smallpox vaccinations to actually Emergent Biosolutions, which he was associated directly with as his old company.
Well, that doesn't seem great. That seems, I mean, you could imagine a potential kickback. I'm not going to say that's what happened, but certainly he curries influence and can do as he wants. Well, I've got to do a little research on this, and you and I are going to speak again. I want to get further into this. Let me take you to just what has happened in the last 36 hours. So this Redfield from CDC, I guess, spoke in front of a Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe, yesterday. And he made this comment. He's fiddling with his mask in his hand. And he was saying, I could argue that this mask is a more vital precaution than a vaccine, which seems interesting because we've had this rush to. Have you seen this clip yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, basically, I was listening to Ron Paul this morning. He was discussing it, and it seems odd. Of course, he's pushing the mask. Continue to wear the mask. But he said in the clip that I saw that he was basically saying, this is potentially, possibly better than even developing a vaccine. Just keep wearing the mask. Now, listen, here again, I am a layman, but I'm capable of logic. And the virus is a tiny, tiny particle. Here in California, we have these terrible fires. They were basically telling someone the other day, hey, listen, the masks aren't really, the air quality is really bad. And the masks that you've been wearing for COVID are not going to keep these smoke particles from entering your body. So you need to be careful about that. Well, the smoke particles are larger than COVID. So the whole mask thing, and the mask thing has bothered me. I wear a mask, not because I think it does any damn good. I do it because I've got stuff to do and I need people out of my way so I can go about my life. That's really the only reason I wear it. And I have heard people say, and this really bugs me when I hear it, just wear the damn mask. And it's said with such an air of condescension and guilt mongering. Listen, people can do whatever they want to do. If they want to wear the mask, I fully support it. But I just don't believe that it really helps that much. And I believe that we've been told this. And another thing, and this is just my personal insight into it, in the Middle East, where they make women wear burqas, and when you create uniforms for people, you're kind of taking away their individuality. In a way, this is just my thinking on this. In a way, it's forcing everybody to depersonalize. And one of the things I hate about a mask, when I go into a grocery store or something and I see somebody, I smile at people a lot. They can't tell that I'm smiling. If they look at my eyes, maybe they can see that I'm acknowledging their presence. And the mask thing bugs me. I wear it because sociologically I feel like I have to, not because I think it does any good.
A mask. What do we see in a mask? We see fear.
Yep.
It
Conditioning.
incites conditioning and fear into our society. And I want to see the studies that actually prove that masks actually are beneficial. Because we have just as many studies on the other side. In fact, I think that it's really, I haven't seen anything that is of definite, oh yes, one way or the other. And I feel like you do. If someone wants to wear a mask, wear a mask. But if you don't want to, there again, that is your privilege. And when in the world have we ever put masks on people who are well? If you're sick, or when have we ever quarantined people who are not ill? This is ridiculous what we're doing, because throughout medical history, let's go back to some history and biblical history. When they had leprosy, did they take everybody and quarantine them? No, it is recorded there that they took those who had leprosy and quarantined them.
Right.
We didn't do it the opposite way. What are we doing? Where is the common logical sense? I can show people just as many studies that show that masks are harmful. They are allowing you to actually breathe in more of your carbon dioxide.
That seems like common sense that anybody that went to school would know.
Well, there have been studies that have shown oxygenation, and they put these little oxygen things on your finger, and they have found that, yes, that in some cases, masks decrease your oxygen usage, and it builds up the carbon dioxide in your body. And that is very harmful to your brain, particularly. And these children don't have necessarily the full lung capacity of that of an adult. And here they are put in these masks. And when I see people outside with masks, I almost just want to come up and rip it off of them, because I think, dear God, get the oxygen in your lungs while you can.
Yes.
And they're not going to spread. Where is our science? Where's our science behind 6 foot distancing? Who did the science behind that? Was that ever backed up with a real placebo test, as Dr. Fauci keeps calling for in other areas?
These seem like the most unscientific methods that you would never think in the 21st century. Oh, people are getting sick, so put on some masks and stay at home and stay 6 to 12 feet away from people. It is so incredibly unscientific that it's shocking, and we could beat a dead horse. I want to ask you about 2 more things, and then we're going to wrap this particular installment up. I'm going to change gears a little bit because we both don't like the mask thing. But you also mentioned that there is now some research that's showing that COVID damages the heart. Could you speak to that?
Yes, Dr. Tom McDivitt at the University of California, San Francisco, has done some studies and has found that the COVID virus does something that no other virus has ever done. And they are shocked at the findings, because Mount Sinai in New York has also, Dr. Samuel has also found very similar findings in their research. And what they have found is that the COVID actually invades what we call cardiomyocytes. And those cardiomyocytes are the cells of the heart muscle. And they have found in some of these cells where the COVID has completely eradicated the DNA of the cell and caused that cell to be, quote, brain dead. And so it can't function. But I think more alarmingly is what they have recently discovered with what we call sarcomeres. What in the world is a sarcomere?
Is it like a telomere? That's a
sarcomere is made up of a thick filament and a thin filament. And these little sarcomeres, they have heads on them, but they also have tails. And those tails are called filaments. And those filaments are what allow us, our heart that is, to have expansion and contraction. Because obviously, when a heart is filling with blood, it has to expand.
And pump.
Like a pump, or like a Ziploc bag that you're going to put water in, or a balloon when you put air in it. It has to have the capability of expanding. But then, in order to be productive, it has to contract. And when it contracts, it has to push the oxygenated blood out to the body. Well, what they have discovered is that the COVID, when it invades these cardiomyocytes, it is fragmenting these little filaments, so they no longer are connecting. And therefore, that weakens the heart and causes them to have probably congestive heart failure, and it causes heart damage. So anyone who has cardiovascular disease is going to be at a higher risk. But what they've also discovered is that it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who has cardiovascular disease. They have found this in previous very healthy individuals who have been left with, or maybe even weeks later, they have developed a myocarditis or an inflammation that has caused them and led to decreased pumping ability of the heart. They say that even athletes are at higher risk because of the high intensity of training that they do. That also has been a caution. And I know I have treated now several university students who happen to be on varsity teams for their colleges and their universities. And I've noticed that they cannot return to their training until they have had the cardiac enzyme that we normally look for in myocardial infarctions, which is troponin. And they have to have troponin levels checked before they can return back, because they are looking for possible cardiovascular and cardio disease.
Is that damage permanent?
We don't know that yet. And that's the question that Dr. McDivitt and Dr. Samuel, they are actually researching that now, because the finding is so new. In fact, this just came out in September the 13th in a couple of the journals, JAMA as well as Nature. It was published. And so we have to see what that's going to show us.
Well, doctor, that takes us back to our beginning point. When people think of COVID, they're thinking of these respiratory illnesses and all the strange effects that it seems to have on us. We can't taste, we can't smell. I don't think anybody really thinks about it having an effect on the heart. And if that's the case as well, then it even further increases the need for us to expand our therapeutic possibilities, which first and foremost should be HCQ. People should be allowed to have that. They should be able to talk to their doctors about it. Their doctors should be able to prescribe it without repercussions. The government should have no business in this.
That is correct. And I'm going to ask if your viewers would go to personalhealthcarenetwork.us and sign that petition and say that at least let's give the American people a choice. Let's don't have the choice made for us by bureaucrats, by individuals who may have other motives other than actually helping many, many thousands of people across this country and across the world. And in other places in the world, they are being allowed to have this medication. So why can't we be the same?
I'm sorry. I agree. One last question. Do you think Dr. Anthony Fauci is using hydroxychloroquine?
I personally do.
I do too.
Because I have many of our physicians, and even including myself, have been contacted by our legislators, our federal legislators, and asked if we could get them some hydroxychloroquine. And so they are touting before the cameras one story.
Yes.
While they are living under the table another. Are we surprised?
No. If you had access to something that could potentially save your life, you would probably want to get it. And they certainly would have access. I don't remember who the leader was, but it was a Central American or South American country who a month or two ago basically said, listen, yeah, I'm on it. I assume that all national leaders are on it, which only makes sense to me.
That was in Brazil. And I actually did help the Brazilians in getting and setting up their hydroxychloroquine. Dr. Zelenko did a great deal. But we had police that were dying there. And so they reached out and we did help them set up their protocols. So nevertheless, thank you so much for having me. Thank you. I hope that by doing this, that we can save lives, decrease the suffering, and stop the fear.
Dr. Graves, thank you for everything you do. I'm going to place the link to Personal Health Care Network so that people can sign the petition. I did sign it yesterday. I'm going to ask my wife and my family to sign it. I believe in it. And I don't think that any of this should really come to a surprise to those who have paid attention. Unfortunately, the media has had such a strong intoxicating effect on the populace that they have been turned away from possible alternatives that make a lot of sense. And to this one has always made sense to me. And I've gone on and on about it to anyone who would listen in my personal life. Dr. Graves, thank you very much. And I hope this can be the beginning of a series in which you and I can discuss more on COVID, HCQ, and then in the future, not to end this on a totally negative note, but I've heard you mention something called COVID-20, which I think we're going to need to get into discussing as well.
I hope next time they have some really encouraging news for you, because we have something that has never been done in this country that is in the making, and I'm not allowed to say it yet because it's going to soon be released, where we can open up schools, where we can open up businesses again. I mean, it's going to be amazing.
Can you at least tell me when we might be able to see? You don't have to tell me what it is, but is there a timetable?
Well, I'm hoping within the next few weeks.
That is beautiful. Dr. Graves, thank you so much. And to my audience, thank you for hanging around and listening to this. I do believe this is the single most important question in the world at this time. What is COVID-19? How do we treat it? Are there ways that we could treat it that we're not treating it? We need to get people back to living their lives and allowing people to be treated with the judgment of themselves and their family doctors.
And real quick, I mentioned that vitamin D, the vitamin C is 1,000 milligrams 2 times a day. Vitamin A is important for the respiratory system. They need 48 to 6,000 milligrams a day. And please don't poo-poo elderberry. Elderberry is very important. It's a zinc ionophore, and it also allows the zinc in the cell. So between 50 and 100 of elderberry every single day. And so and you mentioned the magnesium 400, zinc 25, the copper 2 milligrams. Please, if you don't do anything else, at least do those precaution and building up your immune system. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.